80 years ago, in 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad was underway. According to the author of a new book, the German struggle to take the city and the Soviet effort to defend it is, quote, quite simply the most staggering feat of human endurance, sacrifice, and arms in the history of warfare. On both sides of the conflict, men, women, and children displayed a unique level of courage and devotion to their comrades, unit, city, and country. The losses and suffering are unimaginable, close quote. The book, The Lighthouse of Stalingrad, is a harrowing read and yet a page-turner. Its author, Iain MacGregor, is a seasoned writer on Russia and on war, and he joins me now. Good evening and welcome to Times Radio.
Good evening, Michael. Thank you for having me.
The sentence of yours that I was quoting just now goes on that the devastation of the Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv and Mariupol in 2022 does give one an idea of the losses and the suffering. And I think you must feel that your book is given extra weight and poignancy by the invasion of Ukraine.
No, absolutely. I mean, and I'd finished writing the draft of the book before last Christmas, so that's before the Ukrainian conflict began. But I was very aware of the many friends I've got in Russia, especially in Volgograd now, where it was a discussion point as to what might happen eventually. Not something like this, but. Yeah, I mean, it's weird. This modern war is almost recasting the Russian army from what was going on in 80 years ago in 1942 at Stalingrad. It's almost like a role reversal of the heroic defenders turned into the remorseless invader.
Yeah, but your book very much puts the finger on the fact that the defenders were heroic because they were defenders. I mean, they cared so much about Mother Russia. They cared so much about the city of Stalingrad.
Well, absolutely, and also this was, as I say in the book, it's the deadliest battle of the Second World War, and it's probably, arguably, the bloodiest battle of modern military history. But it was by the late summer, early autumn of 1942. The whole world was watching, whether you're in Delhi, Sydney, Cape Town, New York, Los Angeles. All eyes were on this tributary, this huge river, the Volga, and the city on it, Stalingrad, the city named after Stalin. Whether the German juggernaut could be stopped, because at the time, up until then, they pretty much had their way. They'd obviously hadn't destroyed the Red Army, but they thought the summer of 1942 they'd finished off what they tried to do the year before with Operation Barbarossa, which was the first invasion of the Soviet Union.
Just to remind listeners, Hitler had made a pact with Stalin in 1939, but he broke it in 1941. Invading the Soviet Union, catching the Soviet Union by surprise, rushing towards Moscow, besieging Leningrad, inflicting massive casualties. So just explain how Stalingrad came to be so important.
Well, basically, by the spring of 1942, as you just said, Barbarossa had failed. The Germans had lost nearly over 1 million men in casualties. Their armored forces had been semi-destroyed. And they thought they'd broken the back of the Russians too. The Russians had lost over 6 million men, 3 million killed, and over 3 million captured.
3 million killed. I just want to rest for a moment. In the first year of the campaign, 3 million Russians die.
Yep. And I mean, another startling fact that I discovered when I'm doing the research is the Red Army itself was rebuilt 5 times in total during the whole of the Second World War. Such were the losses that it suffered. But so by the spring, Hitler's got an even bigger gamble on his hands, because by now he's declared war on the United States. It's a global conflict. It's a war of economics as well now. Germany was the only country that hadn't switched over yet to total war factory production. But he knew that if he was going to carry on with the conflict, he needed oil. He needed the mineral wealth that he could get in southern Russia, in the Caucasus, in the oil fields of Maikop and Grozny. He had the Romanian oil fields, but they didn't give him not anywhere near enough of what his war machine would need if he would carry on the fight for the next 5 to 7 to 8 years, possibly in the hope of having an armistice on his terms. So the plan was, instead of doing the expected assault with army groups centered towards Moscow, which Stalin himself was expecting, and had massed all his reinforcements that he'd built up to protect the capital and the center of the country, Hitler plunged south with Army Group South, and he stripped some of the men and machines from the other armies, Army Group Centre and North, uh, as a roll of the dice. And it was to plunge south, destroy, like he had done the year before, encircle big Red Army formations, destroy them in the field, to give the German army then free rein to capture the Caucasus, capture the oil. And at the time, Stalingrad was literally only a city on the map to say we're going to get to the Volga. That will protect our eastern flank while we're doing the main business down in the south.
And if I understood your book correctly, it was vital for the Soviets to hold even a narrow strip of land on the west bank of the Volga. That would be I think it's called the right bank of the Volga, and so to be able to be reinforced and resupplied from across the river.
Yeah, I mean, they were under orders. Vasily Churkov, who was the commanding officer of the 62nd Army, who was in charge of the defence of the central part of the city and the northern factory districts as well. Yeah, I mean, he was diehard communist. He was under orders: remain here, defend it, or die in the attempt. And that's what he was having to fend off. And so they had to protect the western bank. They had to cling. In some places, it was only 100 meters deep. The Germans managed to capture vicious fighting for the first three months until the Soviet counterattack, which obviously then we get the famous encirclement of the Sixth Army. But up until then, the Germans owned about 95% of Stalingrad, and it's a 15-mile long city. It stretches like a ribbon along the Volga River. So it's a big task for any attacking commander to take a city like that, and that's where you get these horrific casualties that both sides were suffering in this lunar landscape of urban combat.
And tell us what you mean by the lighthouse.
Well, the lighthouses is something I was fascinated with. So in Russian history and folklore, there's this legendary 4-story government apartment building that's in the center of the city. And it was generally, before the war, had been used as for technicians and specialists that worked in the factory districts to the north of the city, and for obviously party officials. So it was one of those places that if you were someone, you lived there, it had hot running water, gas, electricity, everything like that. But in the battle, it found itself in no man's land between the invading Germans and the defending Soviet armies. And so it was one of the, because it had been built with reinforced concrete and girders for the basement, it was still standing. So, 2/3 of the city was destroyed by the Luftwaffe at the beginning of the battle. So it was one of the houses that was remaining. And if you were on top of that house, you got a bird's eye view, 360 degrees, 5 kilometers in any direction. So the Germans wanted it because then they would see what the Soviets are up to, trying to bring supplies and reinforcements in across the Volga to the strip of embankment they're still holding on the western bank. And the Russians wanted it because then they could obviously see what the Germans are doing. And so it gained the code name Lighthouse because that's exactly what it was. You'd get this amazing view. And like I said, in Russian folklore and history, it's seen as almost like the Alamo is to the Americans. It's this kind of, it became almost like a scenario of the Seven Samurai or the Magnificent Seven, where this small band of Soviet Red Army soldiers held out against the might of a German division. And that was the legend. And that's one of the main stories that I wanted to research when I went over there, to say, did this actually happen? And if it did, I need to find these people and see if they've left any records.
Yes. And you do that very thoroughly in the book, if I may say so.
Thank you.
Do we have any idea of the number of casualties at Stalingrad?
Oh, yes. I mean, it's where do you begin? It's the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say. It's always the Soviets, because there's at least
many
20
nationalities, yes.
Yeah, and one of the biggest was Ukrainian. And they suffered 1.2 million casualties, of which nearly 500,000 were killed, and the Germans roughly 750 to 820,000 casualties as well. But within the Axis forces, you've got over 115,000 Italian, over 100,000 Romanian, over 140,000 Hungarian. I mean, it was a complete, what they call, it's a horrible name, but it's a meat grinder. It was a complete, it made Verdun look like a child's play compared. I mean, it was just the brutality in such a small area. I mean, even though I said it's 15 miles long, it's when you've got huge formations in just that part of the city, and then on the outskirts, obviously on the flanks, it's just the congestion and the amount of artillery that was dropped, the air assaults by the Luftwaffe. It's something like 2.9 million bombs were dropped on the city during the battle.
91,000 Axis soldiers were captured, of whom I think 5,000 survived to the end of the war. Two last points, if I may. One, Putin relates very much to the Battle of Stalingrad. He likes to be photographed there.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry. Well, yeah, I mean, that was one of his main photo opportunities every year, was to go to Stalingrad, even though his family connection is with Leningrad. His brother died there. His father was seriously wounded. But he always would go to Volgograd, as it's called, and be obviously photographed with the veterans that are no longer here now, and go to the big victory commemorative complex called the Mamayev Kurgan, and that giant statue that some of your listeners might know, with the statue that's taller than the Statue of Liberty and holding its the motherland calls, holding its sword and pointing to the west, to Berlin, I suppose. That's where he wants to be. I mean, that's where he'll still be going if he's still in charge.
And the last question I wanted to ask you was this. You point out in the book how many times over the Soviets were able to replace the army. Just more and more millions of men kept arriving. Is Russia capable of doing that again?
I would... It possibly is, if they had the logistics, the training, the equipment in place. I'm skeptical whether they have that. Judging by what we're seeing and the kind of ramshackled way they're going about mobilizing what forces they can get. And it's scary to think that was only a couple of weeks ago, and already Putin's announcing that they'll be ready to roll in 2 weeks' time. And you just think, what kind of level of training are these poor boys getting?